I think we can now move to the event. Dear delegates, dear colleagues, on behalf of the co-organizers, it is my pleasure to welcome you and thank you for having joined the second Geneva Rights and Climate Talk that we are organizing the margins of the ongoing session of the Human Rights Council. With these talks, we are taking the opportunity in this moment of the year when the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change reports to the Council to reflect on the challenges posed by the impacts of climate change and the interconnected human rights implications. In this second talk, we are discussing the right to science and the threat, which is also a topic that the UN Special Rapporteur, Elisa Morgera, has addressed in her report to this Council on defossilizing our economies, and another work that she has done. And as we are discussing science in this session, I would like to highlight a recent outcome. Last month in Punta del Este, Uruguay, member states established the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution. Together with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as IPCC, and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, known as IPBES, the world now has three bodies to respond to the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity, and land loss, and as of last month, pollution. This achievement is important to the fulfillment of the right to science. However, I think it's important also to mention here that stakeholders, and particularly those active in the human rights community, have stressed that fundamental issues have been forwarded to the first meeting of the panel, including on operating principles, scope, and rules of procedures. They have mentioned the lack of reference in the foundational document to human rights standards and principles such as equality and non-discrimination, gender equality, intergenerational equity, participation, transparency, and accountability. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has also highlighted its commitment to work to strengthen a human rights-based approach in the work of this panel. They have also actually released a document with some arguments. So in our talk, we are of course focusing on the climate agenda and its science policy panel, the IPCC, but I wanted to highlight this important milestone for the multilateral system. And before I hand over to this session chair, Mr. Yves Lador, the Geneva representative of Justice, I would like to remind all that the documents presented, the video and the summary of the event will be made available as usual on the website of this event, and the link is available on the screen. You have also the link. And throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box as explained in the slide, and we'll use them to feed the discussion. Of course, those who are in the room, you can interact directly. So with that, let's now move to our chair, moderator, Yves Lador.
Thank you very much, Diana. And once again, thank you for the Geneva Environmental Network for helping us in organizing this discussion and these talks. As you said, this is the first of 3 talks. And during
Second or fourth?
Yeah, that's right. Yes. We still have 3 to go. And this one is the first of the 3 which are left, but it's part of a longer series. Sorry about that. And the 3 which are left are basically, we'll be focusing on certain elements of the report that has been presented by the Special Rapporteur at the beginning of the week. So today we'll be talking about science, and then we'll have also the question of defenders, and later the question of plastic. But in order to speak about the issue of science, perhaps I don't know if we can see the next slides. We're pretty well here right now in this room. But we are in a we are living very heated days in Europe at this moment. And it's interesting to see, apologies, this is in French, but we can understand very well the different figures which are here. We can see that this raise of temperature is a constant one. We see how the thermic stress is increasing in our different countries. We see these different differences. We see also the very red map on the right side covering Europe. I'm saying this because when you look at the reactions you might have in the public or in some debates or on social media, you do have a lot of comments like, well, it's summer, and in summer it's hot, so what's the big deal? So if ever we have to show a bit of this type of slides and information to show that there is a very much bigger issue behind, and one with science, it means that we have an issue here with science. So of course it has a huge impact on the question of climate change. And actually in your report, Special Rapporteur, you have a whole chapter which you've called the playbook of climate obstruction. And that's precisely the issue we would like to talk today. So Elisa Morgera, as Special Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council on Human Rights and Climate Change, thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think maybe just to start from where we started the event, I think that those three areas of science, our mainstream climate science, but also biodiversity science, our scientific understanding of toxic pollution, and maybe we could add a fourth box around health science, are crucial for us to understand, as I discussed in last year's report on access to information on human rights and climate change, what information we need as human rights holders to understand how climate change is impacting on our human rights, and what kind of human rights it is strengthening, and who is being most affected. And equally, we need all of that information and scientific understanding to be able to assess whether our governments and public authorities are doing enough to protect us from the negative impacts on climate change. And in fact, our own public authorities need the connected information and advancing in that integration of the science to be clear about how they can fulfill their human rights obligations in the context of climate change. So the human right to science was already a human right that I very much stressed in my earlier work last year, and particularly the dimension of how everyone has a right to share fairly in the benefits of scientific advancements without discrimination. And this also has obligation for states in terms of setting priorities for scientific research on the key issues for the most vulnerable, and of course providing sufficient public financial resources for that research, and ensuring that the application and access of scientific progress supports the protection of our human rights. The other side of that obligation is also the obligation for states to protect the public against disinformation and misinformation, particularly when that is motivated by vested interest, and to ensure that the public can benefit from independent technical expertise for the realization of the rights of access to information and participation. And I very much stressed last year how the access to information is really the right that then is a precondition for the exercise of all other human rights in the context of climate change. In this year report, very much learning a lot from our colleague Kate on the call and many other researchers across the world who have been both the object of attacks as climate scientists, but also have been pioneering what is now an extensive body of independent research that has documented how the fossil fuel sector has, over 6 decades, kept the public away from their knowledge of how fossil fuel extraction and burning would be leading us into the climate crisis we are in today, but also taking a whole series of evolving strategies to deny climate change, to deny the role of fossil fuels in causing climate change, and eventually, more recently, once we achieved a very clear global scientific consensus in terms of climate science, then taking further disinformation and misinformation approaches to delay the most effective climate action. And unfortunately, these activities also entail attacks against climate scientists, against journalists, against environmental human rights defenders, abuse of the judicial system, and also an increasing capture of our public policy spaces, from the climate COP, where we have now, again, very extensive documentation of how much fossil fuel lobbyists are outnumbering the representation of member states who are most affected by climate change. But there are many other practices at all levels, from local to international, that shape in undue forms and our public debate and the basis upon which decisions are taken. So the report clarified both the depth of the research and the extensive evidence that is available, and the fact that the industry is following a playbook of this information, but also how that particular set of activities has in and of itself consists of a violation to our human right to information, education and science, and has undermined the exercise of our civil and political rights in the context of climate change, and has prevented everyone's efforts, the effectiveness of our efforts to protect human rights in the context of climate change. And this is why then there's a set of recommendations in my report that calls for defossilizing knowledge. So be not only aware that our public debates and our scientific efforts and our policy-making spaces have been affected by evolving strategies over decades, and that we need, first of all, to untangle, to undo all that work to create a more well-informed space for public conversations, for the important participatory processes that I'm also recommending to then advance defossilization of our economies. And there's several different actions that can be taken, from legislative, from also responsibilities of different sectors of the business community as well, and very much making sure that we are providing to the public full understanding, I think, of how defossilization and so phasing out of fossil fuels, it's not only a matter of energy transition, it's a matter that is economy-wide. It has also to do with our food systems and health system, and it is also a matter that has intergenerational repercussions, which again are very well documented, and there really could be the most important health action we can take. And so very much looking, while focusing on climate change, really realizing how this measure, which has not been prioritized in our climate efforts, also provides so many other essential opportunities to protect human rights in the context of the other planetary crises, including economic inequity.
Well, thank you very much. It was already quite an interesting title that you gave to your report on defossilizing our economy. But then when you added, I remember in some of the recent discussions we had this week here in around the Human Rights Council, this notion of defossilizing knowledge is probably something that will need quite some work in order to be better understood, and because it's, once you dig a bit into it, you see how relevant it is. And it should also probably, at least that's my reading of your reports, and also why I was so pleased in reading it, that the notion of defossilizing is trying to go just beyond decarbonization, which has been basically what we've been discussing about in the field of climate change. And that there's a wider challenge for all of us that you're really pointing to in your report. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's also very helpful. And sorry, maybe I missed a connection there. That once we understand the human rights impact of fossil fuels across the full life cycle, from scoping and extraction all the way to production, transport, burning, and waste management, that we realize that the impacts of fossil fuels, not only as a key source of climate change, but that they also worsen the impacts of climate change by undermining our natural systems that contribute to climate regulation, undermining human health and cultural practices and any other aspects of our human well-being that are essential for our resilience to climate change, and that the carbon tunnel vision that focus on decarbonization in our climate efforts inherently is essential, but leaves out all these other negative impacts on the planet and on humans, which then maybe doesn't give that same clarity of prioritizing the phase out of fossil fuels for a variety of international objectives that are all both affected by climate change, but they can also help us achieve more effectively climate mitigation and multiple benefits for human well-being.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, definitely it's a report we're going to have to work with for quite a while, because it has a lot of very important elements in it that will guide our actions in the field of climate change and new thinking, which feeds, because we should feed us. Because of course, after all these years we've been working on these issues, there's a bit of a tendency to repeat ourselves. So I think your report is bringing a lot in this direction. Now let me turn to Mrs. Lindsay Cook. Lindsay, thank you very much for being with us. In the field of climate change, one of the very important innovation and step forward was the creation of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on climate change. The name is longer, and as you can see, I'm getting confused. We just call it the IPCC. The IPCC has changed also partly how we see the link between science and society. When it has been presented by just before by the Geneva Environmental Network with the very interesting slides, was inspired basically by this innovation, the way the IPCC is working, being a synthesis of the science and not just an expert group which tells you how you should be thinking. Now, Lindsay, yourself with QNO, Quakers United Nations Office, you have been following very closely this work of the IPCC, but you've been also seeing, and you expressed more than once your worries of how it is being slowed down right now, and where in a way the political process that had been second, in a way, put in a secondary position, saying we first want to see what the science can provide in order to have a science-informed discussion, is now being very, very seriously challenged. Tell us how you see this and what is your experience, basically your recent experience of the meetings of the IPCC.
Thank you, Yves, and thank you, Elisa, for your report, and thank you for this title. I'm just going to give a little background, and then I'm going to focus in on examples of the right to science being under threat. This title actually captures why the Quaker United Nations Office became an accredited observer of the IPCC in 2017. And at the time, there were very few observers, very few of those observers speaking in the plenary, and almost no one talking about human rights and human rights-based approaches. And we became active observers and expert reviewer of drafts because we saw a need to protect the integrity of the science and to protect the scientists. We must not underestimate the intensity of political pressures on climate scientists in general, and the potential intimidation they may feel in a room full of country representatives, some of whom want to avoid the mention of the very root causes in our human activities driving existential rates of global temperature rise. And finally, we became active observers because we wanted to help communicate the wider audiences the IPCC findings on urgent, healthy, and rights-based and available at-scale climate actions. But we also discovered another role, and that is to keep the very survival of ensuring the IPCC includes risk language and does not allow weakening of risks in their reports. So as you may have said, the background, but the IPCC was established in 1988. It co-shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997 with Al Gore. The mandate is to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. It does not do the research, but it collates the research worldwide, and it produces these assessment reports. The 7th assessment cycle is now initiated, and the vast majority of scientists are doing this voluntarily. And I like how the IPCC is prioritizing greater voices from the Global South, increasingly from peer-reviewed to also include indigenous knowledge and what they call gray sort of studies, gray research. And I love this space because IPCC co-chairs and lead authors have the right to say no. They have the right to refuse if the states are proposing changes in the language which actually challenges the integrity of their scientific findings. And that's a very different space from the climate negotiations we have in Bonn or in the COPs, because those negotiations are primarily defined by money and power. And the IPCC and the other bodies of scientists which come into this climate negotiation space are really the actual upholders of nature, of what's happening. They are the reality of where we're heading in terms of 3.2 plus Celsius temperature rise by the end of this century, and why it's happening and what we can do. But the IPCC is facing increasingly harsh political pressures, and the scientists are facing massively insufficient global efforts to transform the human activities driving climate change, in particular extraction and burning of fossil fuels. And this is pushing the scientists to include options that fail to transform root causes and in many cases bring new novel risks. As a moderator, thank you, Eve, you talked about policy relevance and policy prescriptive, but I wanted to share how this actually can block and help. So policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive, what the countries always remind the IPCC, is a delicate balance, but it's a major responsibility. And with this combination, the states find the IPCC less threatening in dictating their national policies, but it also means that the IPCC must offer policies and options, some of which are clearly ineffective, inefficient, inequitable, not cost effective, and high risk to people on the planet. Those are the ones that are then seen as policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive, because the policy prescriptive would be the healthy, urgent, and available at scale. The IPCC, if it fails to ensure risk language is not clearly stated in these summaries, then we are at loss. We will lose precious time to meet the ever-closing window of a chance for a sustainable and livable world for all. And the IPCC is increasingly in the limelight. The AR5 findings were critical to the Paris Agreement. The AR6 were critical to a stronger global stocktake, because there was already language that was agreed by states that they could then put into the global stocktake. And that is the reason for the 7th assessment report facing conflict over a timeline. We have spent 3 IPCC plenary sessions in Turkey, Bulgaria, and China in the last 12 months or 15 months, trying to secure an agreement on a timeline. Thankfully, the IPCC can still proceed to nominate authors and move ahead despite lack of delivery dates. But I'm going to reflect on personal reflections of how to protect the right to science. 1, it is critical that the IPCC stands strong and confident in naming the root causes driving existential global temperature rise. The unsustainable energy use, land use change, lifestyle patterns of consumption and production, and as Elisa, her report specifically states, fossil fuels responsible for 81 to 91% of the total historic anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. 2, it is critical that the IPCC does not avoid clearly addressing fossil fuels. I'll give you an example. In the approval process of the 6th Assessment Report Working Group 3 on mitigation, a last-minute political compromise was allowed to pacify certain few states threatening to delay because of the term fossil fuels. The compromise that was put in front and was allowed was to put the words abated or unabated in front of fossil fuels. However, at the time, the IPCC did not have an agreed definition of abated. It was not clear that they had line of sight of research for this. And examples of, for example, carbon capture storage, which is a form of abatement, is an option that the IPCC highlighted for hard to abate emissions such as in cement, but not for a general use. And that is because CCS is not proven to scale, is less effective, more expensive, allows leakage, and to date is used to increase fossil fuel extraction. Months later, with the synthesis report, the AR6 draft failed to include risk language on CCS. Already approved risk language was not in the synthesis. And ourselves and fellow human rights-based observers had to fight to ensure that risk language was included on abatement. It eventually was put in, but as a footnote. 3, it is critical that we repeatedly state that net zero is only possible alongside rapid reduction of GHG emissions. There is no existing techno fix, be it CCS or carbon dioxide removal, etc., that can do this. Only genuine transformation. For example, the rapid reduction of fossil fuels, the rapid increase of energy efficiency, energy conservation, and renewable energies. 4, and finally, avoiding policy prescriptive does not mean avoiding responsibility of warning policymakers of the consequences of their decisions. It is critical that the IPCC takes responsibility in highlighting risks and ensures that clearly stated risk language is next to all options. For example, in the AR6 synthesis report, we had weakened language on carbon dioxide removal. Specifically, we suddenly saw the word very next to large-scale CDR as risk. However, large-scale CDR is at risk, high risk. The word very would have green-lighted the use of large-scale. You avoid very, you do large-scale. We challenged that. We said there's no line of sight, and the word very was removed. But it is frightening that that can happen without clear pushback. Another example in carbon dioxide removal, recently in China, a technologies carbon capture, utilization and storage for national greenhouse gas inventories methodology report, there was strong pushback from a number of high ambition, human rights-based approach voices in the room, both states and also observers, to delay this green lighting of what is CO2 removal from water bodies, known as marine CDR. We pushed for delay because of the profound risk to marine life, because of the lack of research, and because of the moratoriums that are already there that states have signed not to use this. But having it in that report would greenlight it. And so we held that as a risk and to be responsible not to put it in until we had sufficient research. This matters because there is a backlash going on politically, a backlash of not actually addressing root causes, why Alyssa's report is so critical. Thank you for the defossilizing definition. And finally, we need the IPCC to protect the integrity of the science, to ensure risks are clearly stated on dangerous options, and to avoid political pressure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for this very complete and very interesting presentation of the challenge that you can identify in the work of the IPCC already. Very often we see the work of the IPCC coming, and then we think that we have the political challenge. And actually, no, it starts much earlier in the drafting of the final document of the whole IPCC synthesis process. So it's very good to have this in mind and to understand all of these issues. Now, I'd like to turn to some of the people who are with us in the room and also online, because as the Special Rapporteur said, some of them in the field of science have faced a number of threats. And Kate Sell, can I turn to you? You are working at the Union of Concerned Scientists. It's an organization which is working very closely on these issues. Some of your members have been directly targeted and had to face quite difficult situations. And of course, as a union, you're particularly concerned by some of the evolutions going on. And you will be also complemented by Kathy, who is the Fossil Fuel Accountability Campaign Director, if I'm correct. And please correct my presentation if I made mistakes in that. So, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. And thank you for inviting me and Kathy to join you today. I'll start by just sharing a little bit about the Union of Concerned Scientists. We were founded in 1969 by graduate students and their professors at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And we have long played a visible role in promoting and protecting climate science and scientists. We are also NGO observers of the COP processes and the IPCC processes, and members of our staff shared in the 2007 Nobel Prize as scientific contributors to IPCC. So one of the things that we created back in 2017 is what we call the disinformation playbook. And I hope that this framework has been helpful. I sort of saw reference to it in the UN Special Rapporteur's recent report. But it basically lays out the corporate tactics that undermine public understanding of and trust in science. And we have seen this played out and utilized by multiple industries, from tobacco to other kinds of chemicals, to climate change itself. And I don't know if I'm able to share a link to it, but if I am, I will, because I do think the framework is simple and absolutely predictable. And I think what it does is it just, whenever you use the playbook as a way to sort of point out the strategy, that's very effective advocacy. If you can show people the strategy of the fossil fuel industry, then people understand much better how they're being willfully disinformed. I'd also like to note that while the fossil fuel industry promote disinformation regarding climate change science and solutions, they also support disinformation on multiple fronts, largely to gain political power. So in the US particularly, we've seen them fund disinformation on wedge issues that undermine multiple kinds of human rights, such as the right to vote, the right to protest, the right to reproductive care, and the rights of trans people. And at this point, I think we can say we have abundant evidence to see that the US government is essentially enacting the fossil fuel industry's agenda. And one of the ways that they're doing that is dismantling the entire climate science endeavor in the United States. And some examples of how that's playing out include the loss of public access to data and reports that are publicly funded and in some cases congressionally mandated. So I'm talking about the fact that very recently the US government removed the easiest path to access the 5th National Climate Assessment, which is the most recent US-based equivalent of an IPCC report, to the climate science, to the climate literacy guide, and to the fact that there's multiple scientific and activities within the government that are no longer being undertaken, such as launching fewer weather balloons or no longer monitoring sea ice and snowpack. And these losses are born globally as US climate science and climate data are used widely in other countries. So we are not only undermining the US public's access, but the entire scientific community's access to crucial information. I'd also like to highlight the role of online platforms and search engines as a fossil fuel industry ally in disinformation. And I really appreciated the recent report as a way of explaining how this works and how the people, fossil fuel industry and big tech together are profiting off of creating and spreading disinformation. And then I think the last thing I'll say is that one of the things that gives me great hope in this moment is the progress made in Bonn on the UN and UNESCO and member states' global initiative for information integrity. I believe that getting the information of getting the issue of information integrity, including efforts to combat climate disinformation, onto the COP agenda, as the COP presidency have named that they are going to propose for the agenda this information integrity initiative. I think that's tremendously exciting and hopeful, and I'm very grateful to be connected to it. I don't know whether it's best to pause for questions or just to introduce my colleague, Kathy Mulvey. What would you prefer, please?
Please, let's continue with Kathy. Yes, please.
Okay, then I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Kathy Mulvey, who has been researching a particular kind of suppression of climate science, and how by the fossil fuel industry themselves against their own scientists, and how they've, undermined public trust and understanding for decades now. Thank you very much. Kathy, I can't hear
you. Switching. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Union of Concerned Scientists' work on fossil fuel industry disinformation, and specifically a report that we released just a couple of months ago called Decades of Deceit, the case against major fossil fuel corporations for climate fraud and damages. And this comes in the context of a rising tide of litigation, climate litigation, to hold corporations and governments accountable to their responsibilities and obligations to protect our climate and human rights. And it builds on UCS's long history of watchdogging fossil fuel industry climate disinformation, including the 2015 climate deception dossiers that are referenced in the Special Rapporteur's report. So what we did with this report, similar to the climate deception dossiers, is we've brought together several internal company and trade association documents that have been made public through lawsuits, research, congressional subpoenas in the United States, and other investigative methods. And the report really weaves a coherent narrative showing that for decades, many of the world's largest fossil fuel companies knowingly worked to deceive the public about the realities and risks of climate change at the same time that that global warming emissions were spiking, and their own scientists were giving stunningly prescient warnings about the consequences of the company's actions. So one of the things that makes this report really powerful is it brings together the physical and the social science to help us understand where we are today and how we got here. So we show in this report that more than 94% of all industrial carbon dioxide emissions since 1959 can be traced to just 122 fossil fuel and cement companies. And that year is really significant because it marks the start of when fossil fuel companies were already learning about the climate risks of their products. So in 1959, there was a keynote address by the renowned nuclear physicist and Manhattan Project scientist Edward Teller at an American Petroleum Institute event, where he warned the CEOs and other executives of these companies that increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, quote, will be sufficient to melt the ice cap and submerge all the coastal cities. And going back to the physical science, by the early 1980s, so before 75% of global warming, industrial global warming emissions were released, fossil fuel companies had clear scientific evidence of the harm. And one of the examples there is a 1980 presentation by Stanford climate scientist John Larman to the American Petroleum Institute, the fossil fuel industry's largest trade association, at which Larman said that global warming caused by fossil fuels would bring major economic consequences with, quote, potentially globally catastrophic effects. So this is really important in terms of demonstrating that long-term history of the fossil fuel industry's climate deception. And it's also really important to recognize that this deception continues today. And so, you know, the report looks into examples such as current and evidence of greenwashing by major fossil fuel corporations. You know, where, for example, ExxonMobil spent $350 million on a 14-year effort to develop biofuels from algae, which is less than half of what its own experts said was necessary to get this project off the ground. And at the same time, ExxonMobil spent $175 million advertising the program. So that contradiction really shows that executives were aware that they were failing to invest sufficiently to make these biofuels commercially viable, even as they actively promoted the program. And to drive the point home, the company's spending on algae biofuels amounted to less than 1% of its capital expenditures during that time period. We also, in the report, look at the evidence of how the fossil fuel industry has really sought to intimidate scientists and suppress advocacy. So there is a still developing criminal conspiracy case that really seems to take the fossil fuel industry's underhanded activities to new heights. And so this was a scheme that ran from 2015 to 2018 and targeted climate accountability advocates, including some of our own staff at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And court documents and related reporting actually link this hacking scheme to ExxonMobil and one of its major lobbying firms, the DCI Group. And they suggest that the US government possesses evidence that the criminal scheme was indirectly paid for by ExxonMobil. So, you know, in this context, I guess what's really important, and the conclusion that we came to very much mirrors the conclusion of the Special Rapporteur's report, that this is a moment really to dramatically increase the pressure on the major fossil fuel corporations and governments that are covering for them. And so we actually looked at what the Union of Concerned Scientists had been demanding of the fossil fuel industry, and in that context have really concluded that it's a time for everyone, that's elected officials, investors, financiers, experts, and the public, to call on these companies to cease their disinformation and greenwashing on climate science, public policy, and corporate actions, really stop obstructing science-informed public policy and its implementation, and pay an equitable share of the costs for climate damages and climate adaptation and all of the environmental and climate costs of fossil fuel products and production, and actually accelerate their actions toward a fair and fast phase out of fossil fuels worldwide. So that, you know, we very much see that supported by the conclusions in the Special Rapporteur's report. And I'll turn it back to you, Yves.
Thank you very much, both to you, Kate, and to you, Kathy, for this very, very insightful view of the work that you have been doing in your union on the question of integrity of science, which was mentioned before in the presentation concerning the IPCC by Lindsay. So, you know, what we were just saying about the fossil fuel industry, which is interesting perhaps for you to know, is what's happening right now here in this building, in the building just next door here at the UN, because after the report, which has been presented in some of the side events, there is a negotiation of the annual resolution on human rights and climate change. And at this moment, the question of fossil fuel is not included in the proposal, which is on the table, and that has to be adopted next week. But we know that there is an amendment which is being proposed to include it. So it's going to be an interesting political test to see which remains a very, very weak formulation, but a clear one that in order to protect human rights, you must include also possible pathways away from fossil fuel. So it'll be interesting to see next week if this amendment passes or not, and how things will be developing at the Human Rights Council. But definitely, we can say that this year a step has been made in this tough discussion between states on do we include or not the question of fossil fuel when we're talking about the question of human rights and climate change. It's at least now here on the table. We'll see how far it will go, but it's an interesting reaction to what you were presenting. And I'd like also perhaps to add something, and I don't know if the team here can bring the last slides I had proposed. Because on the top of what the industry has been doing as you were presenting it, we also have, unfortunately, all the activities which are done by the current administration at the head of the United States. And here with this picture, and this is coming from a presentation that was done by Climate Central, who's doing quite a work on making public the information coming directly from the scientific community. What is interesting here is to see the Argo, the network of these different devices which help to identify the different elements of ocean science. Here you can see, which is surrounded, is the number of these different Argo devices which are coming directly from the United States. The point here is to see that what is happening in the US is not a purely US issue. It is affecting the whole of international science. Climate science has been right from the beginning an international one. So now you have a number of studies which we don't know whether they will be published, because precisely you had American scientists, you had money coming from the public in these researchers, which are finished, which even went through the peer review system. But now these scientists, some of them who are at the origin of, are not allowed to publish them anymore, which means the whole world is not allowed to see what is the result of the most recent scientific publications. There is also the fact that as a number of data are being taken away, then we have an issue of how are we going to do the continuity of the measurements. Because of course, if you can't access the data you had before, then we have again a scientific problem. So underlying here is the issue that you were showing and what has just been described in the IPCC, or what the industry is doing. Also, how now administration are adding to this very, very dark situation by breaking the science itself. So it's not just an issue of going against academic freedom or restricting some researchers. It is making for the public, for all of us, impossible to have absolutely the full picture of what is the situation field. And of course, you can expect immediately that what's going to come next is when you will try to go over this and say, oh, well, anyway, we can guess what we would be coming out, even though we're not allowed to use these data anymore. You'll have an attack saying, oh, this is not scientific correct. And then you have a big discussion on that. And that's just going to bring more confusion. But the fact that we might not be able to use the correct information about what's going on out there is more than worrying, and should basically trigger a reaction from all states and from all of us. And I'm very surprised, and that's why I'd like to have your reactions from you, Special Rapporteur, but I'll turn also to Mylène Bidot, who's Human Rights Officer here at the Office of the High Commissioner. And Mylène, you've been working with the Special Rapporteur on cultural rights, and you have been working also on academic freedom. I know also Ben Schachter from the Office of the High Commissioner is here. I was really wondering, how do you think that the human rights system can bring a reaction to what is going on? Because now my feeling is that the discussion we have on science remains very much national, like that's affecting the others, and it could be a problem, you know, if you don't have enough academic freedom, and that's it. when it seems from what we are hearing is that the destruction of the right to science is much more severe than that. And I was wondering what are your evaluation of that and how the human rights system could bring its own contribution in this situation. So I don't know, Milene, if perhaps you want, I'll give you the floor first. Then perhaps, I don't know, Ben, if you want to react, and then I'll turn to the special rapporteur.
Thank you, Yves. Well, the human rights system is very weak to address these issues. I think we lack also an understanding of science as a common public good and knowledge as a common good, and I think we don't work enough on that aspect. It's true that working with the special rapporteurs, we can work as a system, and that's what we usually do. But we have to do it more, and there are various angles to the issue. Like, I was very interested to hear the work you've done. I didn't read the report yet, but I see like this bits missing from my point of view. Like, for example, I would be interested to know whether, because we know that fossil fuel industries also encroach on the work of universities, that they also block information there. They promote, it's always the same, they promote a narrative and block the other. So they also use universities for this. And well, when we were working on the academic freedom, that's something we saw, but we don't have enough capacity to do the research. We don't receive information from NGOs so that we could work on it. I mean, we can't ourselves, we lack tools to proceed to inquire. We receive information, we act on information. So we know there's a lot of things happening, but we don't necessarily receive requests to act. Another thing I was seeing, and I think that's why we have really to work together, is I like very much this defossilizing knowledge, but to make it wider, maybe defossilizing culture. And we've worked a lot on advertising and cultural rights and the promotion of consumer culture through advertising, blocking artistic narratives, contrary to this, for example. So it's always the same tactic. And also working on cultural rights, we have this understanding of cultural rights as the right to live your own ways of, to conduct your own ways of life. That can be also problematic, and we have to think further. We have digital lives. Mobility has become part of the main culture, at least in this part of the world, but we don't really challenge cultural rights from that aspect. But so Ben, maybe you want to complement. I don't know whether I responded to your question. You took me by surprise a little bit. But yes, I think a coordinated work, and we need information from the ground to come. And we got talking about the situation in the USA. We read everything through the press, but we don't really receive requests to act. And it's impossible for us to inquire.
So cool, we're hearing. Thank you very much. Ben, do you want to add something to that? So Ben, you're the coordinator of the climate and environment team within the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. So if you want to add a few things.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Yves. So I'd say, first of all, we're working on and approaching this from a number of angles, right? And one of those angles is just trying to build an understanding amongst people and scientists that there is, in fact, a right to benefit from scientific progress and its applications. And I think very fundamentally that is often lacking or not part of the discussion. Then you have to think about what does that right entail? And say in environmental negotiations and in context, one of the things that we're talking about is a right to be free from conflict of interest or misinformation or disinformation in the context of policy-making processes, right? That we should actually ensure that decision-making processes are evidence-based and science-based. And we've been engaging with the major science policy platforms, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the negotiations of the Open-Ended Working Group for a Science Policy Platform on Pollution, which concluded about a week ago. And Uruguay, in order to really advance that, everybody should have access to the best available scientific information about climate harms. Another area that's very important is addressing threats against scientists. And we know from working with and coordinating with scientists that independent scientists are often subject to harassment or persecution or loss of grants or other problems when they're conducting research in these areas. And so we have to address that as well. And then thinking about indigenous peoples and others' knowledge as scientific knowledge as part of the solution to these problems. So those are a few of the kind of main areas of work that I would highlight briefly. Back to you, Yves.
Thank you very much, Ben. I mean, it's quite interesting to see also how we can use the system. Let's just not say just be complaints and just formulate complaints about the situation, but also see what are the actions. And I think you have indicated some of the elements we should be following. Just before I give the final and concluding remark to the Special Rapporteur, I wanted to ask to Lindsay, Kate, and Cathy if you had a word. I insist just a word, unfortunately. This is because of the time we have left. But if you wanted to react on what we've been saying or add some elements before we get to the concluding remarks of this discussion. Lindsay, perhaps you first.
I'd just like to say thank you for everyone who's been on this panel and for all the work that you've done, and Alyssa for the intensive work. Thank you.
Kate or Cathy, would you like to add anything, please?
Please keep calling on us. Whatever you think we might be helpful has been and we would this morning.
Cathy?
You're muted.
Can help to strengthen multilateral actions that are happening in the IPCC and across the COP. And so, we appreciate the strong connections that are being made here between defossilizing and protection of human rights.
Thank you, Cathy.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Yves, and all the organizers for bringing us together to reflect on this part of the report. And maybe just to conclude, I think, the point you made around how aware are government representatives and international fora where we work with, and there are multiple ones on climate and human rights that we're working with, including plastics, which we'll discuss tomorrow. But here, the Human Rights Council is a space, the climate process is a space. In all those spaces, I think maybe our government representatives see science, as you say, as a national process, whereas it is very much an international network of efforts. And they often also see science and knowledge production as something that happens before we do climate action. And a lot of the work I've done on human rights is really been about looking about how we co-produce knowledge as a way to really take into account all human rights dimensions, all the voices of knowledge holders and the lived experiences of the human rights holders that are most affected by climate change. And that is, I think, the most helpful way to also prevent those disproportionate impacts, to take into account intersectionality through that co-production of knowledge. And so it's important then to think about obligations and responsibilities to protect human rights in the context of climate change through that lens of how crucial knowledge production is. What are the obligations of states to protect research, to appropriately fund it, to establish priorities that are aligned with human rights impacts, and then the responsibilities of universities themselves in terms of what funding they accept, in terms of how they protect their own researchers to take independent research forward, the responsibility of private finance going into research. And I think a big piece of work that goes very much to that point of also defossilizing culture is like the efforts that many of us will need to make to include this understanding of the playbook and the impacts that it has had on our understanding of the climate problem and climate solutions in education at all levels, because we are all I guess people of my generation and older, our all minds have been framed by this very multi-decade strategies from the fossil fuel industry, and we all have so many assumptions that are embedded in how we have framed climate action. The question of the working beyond the carbon tunnel vision, all some of the terms that have become of common use in our climate conversations, but they're all actually part and parcel of that grand design of keeping us away from root causes and true solutions that can be effective within the time frame we have to avoid more catastrophic climate change.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope we've been able to give an illustration of one of the elements that is in the report, and which is very important. We will have the possibility to come to other elements tomorrow on the question of climate defenders, and then afterwards on how we get locked in a plastic approach. But I'll turn now directly to Diana from the Geneva Environmental Network. And once again, I want to thank Diana and all of her team, because it's really thanks to them that we're able to have these different talks. So Diana, thank you very much.
Thank you, Yves, and thank you to the UN Special Rapporteur. It's impressive to see all these messages that you have been sharing here in the sidelines of the Council. And I just wanted to reiterate the message of Yves to welcome you to two other events that we're organizing tomorrow on defenders and on plastics in the run-up to the plastics treaty negotiation that will take place here in Geneva in 1 month from now. So for the links will be shared. You see them on the screen for those who didn't yet know that those sessions were happening. Don't hesitate to join us, and some of the friends we have here will also be on the panel. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this event, the summary of this talk and the key messages that were shared and the links that our panelists also were mentioning will be available on the webpage of this event. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.